turn the floor over to our wonderful guest tonight. But BLUU Supports is a new initiative that we just launched, which extends our goal as an organizing collective of justice making and liberation through our faith. And with BLUU Supports, what we're going to do is highlight a different project, program, or organization each month that aligns with both our UU principles and, of course, the principles of Black Lives of UU. And I am so ecstatic to kick off this new program with a project that's really near and dear to my heart, the Black Trans Prayer Book. And so we're going to learn from its creators tonight more about the project. You'll learn about how it came to be and a little bit more about their own spiritual journeys as well. I think you're in for a real treat tonight. And as an added bonus, we have an amazing moderator for this evening, Reverend JaeLynn Scott. And for those who do not know JaeLynn is a religious educator and community minister who encourages individuals and congregations she works with to take courageous leaps of faith. She and her 15-pound furry companion, Bodhi, have worked as a religious educator in the Unitarian Universalist context for various congregations, and her work focuses on spiritual practice, queer theology, and social justice. As a transgender woman of color, issues of diversity and inclusivity are the cornerstone of her writing, facilitation, and preaching. Reverend JaeLynn was a 2014 FOS Fellow, where she began her work looking at the intersection of African-American spiritual practice and racial justice. And she currently resides in Edmonds, Washington, where she is engaged in community ministry with Seattle area queer youth. And so with all of that said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Reverend JaeLynn Scott, and y'all will learn so much more about the amazing project that we're supporting this month with BLUU Supports, the Black Trans Prayer Book. Have a great day.
Thank you, Leslie. I am so honored to be here with Mase III and Lady Dane Figueroa Didi, both young elders in our community, in our trans community, and also Black trans community. I'll do a brief introduction for them. So Lady Dane is dubbed the ancient jazz priestess of Mother Africa, honey. And she is a Nigerian, Cuban, indigenous, American performance artist, an author, an advocate, playwright, educator, choreographer, two-time Helen Hayes Award nominee, speechwriter, healer, and the founder of the Anana D Initiatives. Yep, that's worth a snap, which produces and cultivates events and initiatives designed to center and celebrate the work of transgender and gender nonconforming artists of color. She is the first trans woman of color in DC to publish a work of fiction, Yamaya's Daughters, pick it up, 2013. And it was the first trans woman to be nominated for the Helen Hayes Award and to have a play produced in DC, Clytemnestra, an epic slam poem at Theater Alliance. And I just found out, I think, she was also named Miss DC Pride.
Latinx Pride.
Latinx Pride. Thank you.
Let's get it right, honey.
Get it right. Yeah, right. That's a lot better. Thank you for being here with us. And then Mase III, many of you know his work, particularly Unitarian Universalists that might be in community with us. He is a Black trans queer poet and educator based in Seattle by way of Philly. That's a long byway of Philly. As an educator, Mase has worked with community members in the U.S. and the UK, Canada, and et cetera, on the needs of LGBTQIA youth in spaces such as K through 12 schools, universities, faith communities, and restricted care facilities. He is founder of, and is it Awkward, AWARD, the first trans and queer people of color talent agency. His work has been featured on MSNBC, Essence Live, Everyday Feminism, Black Girl Dangerous, the New York Times, BuzzFeed, The Root, the Huffington Post, and more. Wow, those bios, honey. Thank you so much for being here also. So I want to start out with folk who may not know the Black Trans Prayer Book, and just tell us, what is it?
So Dane usually has me go first, so I'm just going to jump in because Dane's looking at me like, you already know the drill, Mase. So I'm going to take that. And so the Black Trans Prayer Book is is a developing piece, and it's a project that we're coming together to co-edit. And so it's going to start with a retreat, and what it's going to be is a collection of poems, stories, prayers, history by Black trans people, specifically on a theology that's interfaith, that censors Black trans divinity. So we're going to be coming at it from very multiple faith angles, and we're going to be creating a healing tool, as well as, like I said, a historical document, as well as a living, breathing theology that exists sort of out in space somewhere right now, but hasn't really been collected in the ways that we're trying to do it. So we're trying to make an intentional space to talk about Black trans people and Black trans bodies in the text. Was that good, Dane? Did I do good?
I love it.
Oh, goodness.
And Dane, would you like to add to that?
No, I mean, I feel like Mason really said it all. For me, it's that a work like this is so absolutely necessary, particularly like given the climate that we live in. And for so often, I kind of talked about this at a storytelling summit that I spoke at a few weeks ago. As I said, you know, what abusers like to do, what colonizers like to do is they like to try to take the story, erase us, and then rewrite it. Mm-hmm. And so it is so important for us to really center ourselves in our stories, to celebrate ourselves in our stories, and to also support the storytelling and the work and the healing of people like us. And if we're a colonizer, people who are oppressed because of our privilege. And so, this document, this book, this tome, this healing balm is so absolutely necessary right now because we've always been under attack. Mm-hmm. We've always been under attack when colonization has come into play. But there is something in the air now, I think spiritually, metaphysically, where really it is the end of the patriarch and it is the birth of the mother. And because of that, everyone who's steeped in the patriarchy is trying everything that they can to wipe us all out, every last one of us, and take themselves while they're at it. So it is important for us to use every gift, every tool, every piece of magic that we have to pour back into us. And so this work is a piece of that. It's a piece of that web that we are weaving spiritually, metaphysically, magically to help heal us, to help protect us, to help give us a tool to help us thrive, really.
Thank you. I want to reflect back on, you mentioned the colonizer trying to take us out, right? You know, and by us, I assume you mean trans people of color, trans and gender nonconforming people of color. I want a little bit about both of your spiritual backgrounds or religious backgrounds and how maybe in those contexts and other religious contexts you've been in, that patriarchy that's or the colonizers, right, trying to wipe us out. How have you experienced that in other communities?
I mean, how have I experienced it? Every day of my life. Like I don't know what's. This is the thing. Like, white supremacy is so insidious. Because it is embedded in many of the systems that we have here, particularly in this country, let alone around the world. And so when I think about my ancestors, when I think about when colonizers stepped foot on this land and stepped foot on Africa, what they saw, right? What they saw is they saw they saw people who loved people like us. They saw people like us. They saw we were essential to spiritual life. They saw that we were essential to the day-to-day activities. They saw that our communities could not exist without us. And so with that said, as they attempted to solidify their power, they wanted to take power away. And so the way that they did that was that they attempted to destroy anything that reminded people like us, and when I say people like us, I mean Black people, I mean brown people, of the amazing, magnificent history and power that we had. And no one reminded white supremacy, no one reminds white supremacy as much of the legacy of power, prestige, beauty, joy, delight, spiritual enlightenment. No one reminds white supremacy as much as trans and gender non-conforming people of that fact.
Dane, was that the experience, Lady Dane, was that the experience of your religious upbringing? Did you have that sense, or was that a new development, your understanding of this?
For me, something never felt right growing up. Like I could feel the Holy Ghost, but it was it was like, I can't even explain it. Like even when I went to the mosque, right? Like even when I went to the mosque, I was like, the Holy Ghost is here. There is spirit here. There is God here. But the people who are preaching, or the people who are practicing, are so steeped in their own white supremacy, like internalized anti-Blackness, internalized colonization, that there is something that's not connecting for me in those spaces. And so what I did for myself is that I read, my aunt Liz Figueroa, education was really important for her, and learning for myself was really important for her, and learning about my history. And as I began to not necessarily feel like these particular spaces were for me, and not because I was who I was, but because someone had taught Black people to hate me. Someone had taught Christians to hate me. Someone had taught Muslims to hate me. Someone had taught these patriarchal Father God, Abrahamic religions to hate me. Mm-hmm. And not because the text told them to. Somebody else had told them to. And so I was like, something isn't right. So as I began to study the people who created the text, I discovered myself. I discovered people like me. And so I went on a journey myself personally. I was a Christian mystic. I was a pagan. I am a priestess of several paths, one of which is the Lukumi path. And what I found there was all of these texts that had informed me that I was there. People like me were there, and we were essential. And then that caused me to then go back to things like the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and be like, oh, I'm here too. Mm-hmm. I was here all along. They lied. They tried to erase me. And then why was that? Oh, because how do we get them? The versions that we have now: white supremacy, colonization, patriarchy. So where there is patriarchy, there is truly the absence of God, because patriarchy only loves itself. And patriarchy loves itself more than it loves anything else, and that is including the divine being. That's my belief.
That's beautiful.
So that's what I discovered.
Powerful theology. It's a powerful Mase, could you tell us a little bit about your Muslim background, and maybe how, reflecting on some of the comments by Lady Dane?
So I would say similarly, I actually grew up, so just as Dane was talking about going into different multiple faith backgrounds, and especially even as a young person. So I grew up in a Christian and Muslim household. I grew up with a parent who was Baptist and a parent who was Nation of Islam. When I think for myself about what that meant as a Black trans person, kind of coming up into these things, I came out kind of early as a queer person, later as a trans person. And before I even came out, before I even had language around my sexual identity and my gender identity, all those different things, and my attraction identity, all these different things, people already had language for me in their faith spaces, right? And those were words that weren't always friendly. Those were words that weren't always positive. And particularly, again, even as Dane's saying, because someone had taught people a certain way of looking to hate me, or something that was different from what was supposed to be expected based on the ways that colonization and white supremacy had impacted their reading of the text. When I before I came out even fully as a trans person, I had already been exercised by multiple people, right? I remember, having these experiences where people, we often get punished for people as being people that oftentimes cannot pass as cis people, cannot pass as straight people. I first, for myself, when I came out to my Christian side of my family, which I do have some preachers and pastors on that side of the family, that was something that in that side of the family they had learned a very certain type of passive faith. And when I say passive faith, I mean the sense of that, you go to church, someone tells you what to believe, good, bad, or different, or even if it's in alignment with what's happening on the ground, and you kind of go with it. And so for me, for a long time, I left faith not because both sides of my family had rejected me, but specifically because what I learned from the Christian side of my family told me that there was no place for me within those faiths, right? I came back into faith as an adult. I had gone into working in queer spaces, and specifically with an organization where a lot of my work required that I went into congregations of different kinds and talked about LGBTQ issues. I had a supervisor who was very lovely, but had her own trauma around faith and was terrified of going in these spaces. For me, I think, for many, I think Black folks in the States, regardless of whether or not you believe in Christianity or Islam or wherever you grew up, some certain faith practices are kind of in our bones, right? It's in our cultural framework, right? So even though I had not necessarily felt comfortable being at church, like as far as the theology that I learned, the music, the ceremony was in my bones, right? Like I had to actually be there. So my supervisor's like, oh, I don't feel comfortable being in these places. I said, I'll go. I love church. I love mosque. I love all these places, right? And so when I did start going, I started learning more about the difference between defensive theology and liberation theology, right? So defensive theology being 99% of where most of our conversations start when we talk about trans people and queer people in the text. And so what defensive theology is when someone, especially when we're looking at the Abrahamic faith, takes some 6 to 7 scriptures, the majority that people use being in the Bible, right? Let's be honest about that, where they say, oh, well, Leviticus says this, right? And so then you have people that are anti-trans or anti-queer saying this thing about Leviticus, and defensive theology wants you to debate that person, right? So at best, you're saying that this scripture has nothing to do with trans or queer people. At worst, you're in a circular conversation with a bigot who hates you and thinks you're going to hell, right? And there's no real affirmation in that text. And so finding liberation theology and the space in which there are trans bodies in the Quran, there are trans bodies in the Bible, there are trans bodies in all these different types of religious texts, meant that I could find myself and see myself. And it changed the ways that I did activism. It changed the ways that I saw and felt comfortable coming back into the mosque, coming back into the church. And it totally, completely flipped on its head the ways that I saw myself reflected in God.
From both of you, I've heard particularly about this, the magic, and not that we're magic people, but the magic of...
Oh, we are magic. I'm magic. Dane magic. You magic. We magic people.
And so, not to be balked at, but maybe to be healers. And I'm acknowledging my resonance with that idea, and I want to reflect on particularly at the BLUU revival that we just recently had in Kansas City, Black Lives Unitarian Universalism. This was a space that had been organized with, trans folk taking leadership in organization and also in ministry, right? The significance of trans people actually ushering in ritual. And it was one of, if not the most powerful spaces that I've ever experienced within Unitarian Universalism. A magic happened that had not been there when it was cis or straight or white, leadership. So will you talk a little bit more about the importance of having trans and gender nonconforming folk lead ritual, and also maybe, let's just talk about that. Yeah.
So what I would say is what I think is really important is, to be honest, I think there's a lot of ways in which when people in especially white denominations hear trans, they're always thinking about white trans people. I think, so to me, what I want to kind of name is I don't think it's just important for trans people, but specifically for Black trans people, and specifically for Black and brown trans people to be able to run different types of faith spaces. Just going back to what Dane said, so even when we look at, so a really great piece of history I got from a historian, a non-binary Black historian named Malcolm Shanks, was talking about the story of Balboa, who was a colonizer who came to what is now Panama, as well as a bunch of other colonizers, and specifically saw all these different folks who were gender nonconforming and decided that the Christian thing to do was to kill everybody in that town and in that space, and kill everyone that, as even Dane was sort of referencing, that even had recollections of trans and gender nonconforming people being holy and being seen, right? And so transphobia must be looked at as a white supremacy issue and must be looked at as a colonization issue. And so we cannot get better at dealing with those things by having people that have never experienced or do not have the historical framework leading that kind of discussion, right? So when you were a kid and you learned that 1 + 1 = 2, you learned that 2 + 2 = 4, you learned multiplication, division, you know, you developed a certain type of level of skills around math, and you decide at whatever age that you got to, whether or not math as a form of study for you was for you, right? We never expect someone with a kindergarten level of math to have the same conversation about math as we do in astrophysics. But we assume because we have these same bodies, like as trans people, as cis people, as white people, Black people, brown people, just because we can inhabit the same rooms, that we have all of the same exact knowledge, or that we can have the same conversation. I cannot get better about understanding Black liberation theology and trans liberation theology, and especially Black trans liberation theology, if I'm only talking to people that only started talking about race when they got to adulthood. I cannot start having that conversation with people that just started getting better talking about gender if they've only started thinking about trans people when they hit adulthood. These are concepts and identities and frameworks of being about my whole magical self that I've had to come into being before, like from a child, right? So this is an understanding that I have that is very deep, and I did for the necessity of my survival, right? And so if we want a deeper, more passionate theology that is more nuanced, that is more clear, that creates more space for the expansiveness of God, then we must create space and demand space in which people that are most marginalized, that have been having these more intensive conversations, being at the forefront.
Thank you, Dane. You have anything?
No, I was going to say that, I was going to say, Black and brown, trans people, gender nonconforming people have always been magical, have always been magic. This is at the heart of our ancestry. And because it's at the heart of our ancestry, it is something that is in the DNA of Blackness. Mm-hmm. It is in the DNA of Blackness, and we cannot get away from it. And so there is a disconnect that happens, particularly now. I'm going to talk about the Black community. When the Black community tries to deny that, there's a psychological disconnect and a re-traumatization that happens even to cis people when they try to deny that. My own journey is that, when I began to truly accept all of who I was, I got a lot of my training from cis women, from Black cis women. And these Black cis women had already been like, this my sister. And so, when I was like, okay, girls, I'm coming out, right? Because these Black cis women were steeped in a historical knowing of what the temple was like before patriarchy, before white supremacy. These Black cis women said, yes, sis, we will do ceremony. We will welcome you. We will hold you. Anything that you need from us, we will give it to you, because we understand that we were side by side in the temples of old. And so my whole understanding around, when I go into a place and cis people don't respect or recognize the leadership of trans people, I'm like, what are you doing with your life? Even in pagan, even in spaces that are not quote unquote Abrahamic. When patriarchy creeps up in these other spiritual spaces, I'm like, that ain't how none of this is supposed to look. So, yeah, we can't address transphobia separate from white supremacy. Transphobia is born in white supremacy. And so if we're having a conversation now about trans rights and we're not putting it in the framework of it being the child of white supremacy, I just don't know what people are doing. That's what I'm saying about that.
Thank you. In regards to the Black Trans Prayer Book, I notice just in the work that the two of you are doing, I honor and I lift that you try to lift leadership from within the trans community. And it sounds like a lot of this is about allowing trans and gender nonconforming people of color to step into their leadership. What might that look like with the retreat and also following? Like if I was a Black trans person who is Magic watching this and I'm interested in this project and participating, what might my experience with it be?
So I'm going to talk about this as someone who does a lot of work with different types of churches and mosques and stuff around the country and around different places specifically, right? One story in particular that kind of strikes me is I remember going into this one affirming LGBTQ affirming congregation, and they had all these rainbows all over the place, all this kind of stuff. And so at some point they asked me, I was given a workshop on, different trans liberation theology stuff. And so at one point someone stopped me and said, Mase, when you came here as a trans, did you feel accepted? Did you feel included? Did you feel like we made this space that you would feel welcomed at? And so this is a mostly about 95% white congregation. So I looked at the person and I said, and a trans person like me, when you made this space affirming, you didn't know what that meant. You didn't know that there would be Black trans people that would come in here, because when I came in here as a Black person to your congregation, nobody spoke to me for the first 35 minutes. Even though we were at lunch, even though I smiled at everybody that came into the door. It wasn't until Black elders came in who were not trans or queer, but saw me as a Black person and sat down with me at lunch and broke bread with me, that anyone even acknowledged my presence in a congregation, right? And so, for me, when I think about this, the reality is that a lot of even spaces that perceive themselves to be LGBTQ affirming spaces, again, have not made space for the nuance of talking about how does the ways that we imagine, especially when we think about congregations and organizations and religious spaces that have access to wealth, that have access to land, that have access to buildings, that have access to all these things, and how they specifically also play into gentrification, play into the running away of Black bodies, into the ways that especially trans folks of color in congregations of all different types of backgrounds get run out. This kind of book and project makes us say, hey, while you were being run out of this congregation that said, that was spitting all this theology that they, said was supposed to be affirming, or said all these things while still removing you, you were creating a theology again of existence. You were creating a theology, and you were living in an existence around theology that was real for you and allowed you to survive this long. And so we want to acknowledge and empower that. We want to empower a legacy of Black trans people that came before us, that made a way for us when there was no way, right? That made a way for us when there was no money, that made a way for us when there was no space.
Right.
When other people didn't want to call you the right name. And so this is going to be a project that gives space for us to acknowledge the history that we've learned about ourselves. It's going to also credential Black trans bodies as experts of theology, because we're experts of theology, right? We're experts of naming and talking to God in all the ways, and Allah and Goddess and all the entities that allow us to be here and to manifest ourselves. And it's going to, as we shared earlier, that there is not a text that exists like this right now in this country or elsewhere that we're aware of, even though we know that some of this history has been passed down, but it's only been passed down to us. And we want to make sure that it is a place where those of us that need that space to kind of come back to and say, oh, there's nothing wrong with me, and I can find myself in these texts, and I can find myself in this practice. We want us to be able to reflect into that. And so even that is us coming into power, knowing that there's that we're not crazy, right? And I said it in all the kinds of ways, because people will make you feel like your very desire to be reflected in theology and to be in control of your own theological story and narrative. There's something wrong with that, right? Because you didn't get an MDiv in the way that you were supposed to from this organization that's been running you out as a denomination for years, right? Because you didn't get to sit in that church or mosque or synagogue or wherever, right? Or temple, wherever, that didn't want to say your name and allowed you to get physically assaulted with their own words, like outside on the street, right? So we want to kind of do all that. We want to make it clear that we're experts in that way.
And before I move back to Dane, I just want to note that this is part of BLUU Supports, and it is a fundraiser for this project. And you can find a link to how to support on the Black Lives UU website. That's blacklivesuu.com /BLUU, BLUU supports. And you can donate for this wonderful project there. Dane, you could either if you want to reflect on what Mase has just said, or maybe give us a picture of what that time together with Black Trans Prayer Book, the times, the spaces that are these people will be gathering will look like. What does that feel and look like? And realizing that we do have some white folks in the audience who you may not want to say everything, but what does it really look like? Give us a picture.
It looks like returning home. It looks like remembering ritual. It looks like a peace. It looks like a peace that so many of us have always wanted from spiritual and religious spaces. It looks like the ancestors' wildest dreams. It looks like healing. It looks like family. It looks like accountability. It looks like moving forward together. That's what I imagine.
Can I actually ask a question?
It's gorgeous. Yes, please, Mase.
So JaeLynn, as someone who's been ordained, who's been doing this kind of faith work, so I guess the question for you, so we're obviously doing this book together. Have you, as someone who has been in faith work for a long time now, ever been in a space that affirmed you on all sides as a Black trans person? What does that look like for you? So I would love to hear you talk about that as a leader in this movement.
No. I think the closest that came was at this BLUU revival, because it was Black trans and gender nonconforming folk in leadership. And they are who I had my eyes on, particularly in that space. But it always has been in the context of prioritizing the need of cis folk, and that's always a part of it. It's an addendum that it's trans, and we bring our magic, but it's not acknowledged. I think in that space, I need ritual. I need reclamation of ritual, right? All of those things that you and Lady D had talked about, particularly about the ancestral roles that we held before. I need permission to step into those ancestral roles, right? And step into my inheritance as a Black trans woman. I also, need to learn from you two, particularly the theology that you've been doing for a long time. This trans theology that you're speaking has rarely and barely been spoken in public spaces. So to hear more of this, to learn more of this, and to become fluent in that space. And I need time to cry. Right.
There's going to be lots of tears. There's going to be lots of tears and hugging. We love doing that. We're so excited.
That's right, honey.
I will cry right now.
Yes.
When I'm talking like, so yes, all of that. Yes. All that.
Because what I think is so important, so you as a leader, so thinking about, and so I want everyone that's also watching this to think about, we're all spiritual leaders. Most of us have never experienced that as Black trans people, to be able to be in a space that was centered for ourselves. And people do not understand what that means. To come into a space and to know that there's a 99% chance that my identity is going to get challenged today, that someone's just going to pat themselves on the back because they got my pronouns right twice. Meanwhile, if I ask them, how am I as a trans person affirmed, as a Black trans person affirmed in their text, the only thing they can give me is God is love, and they have no nuance or analysis around what that actually means. They have no way of looking at story. They have no way of spinning it. They have no way of thinking about their practice and the ways they participate and use their congregation dollars to support white supremacy every single day. They have no sort of sense of that. And we deserve a space like that. We deserve a space that holds us, allows us to not feel like we are the unicorn in the room, even though we're all special like unicorns, right? We should be able to feel like, I remember the first time I was ever in a Black trans specific space. It wasn't even of faith, but knowing, and it was to be surrounded by other Black trans people. And I'm not talking about hundreds of other Black trans people. I'm talking about like maybe 10 other Black trans people. I was probably 29 years old, right? It was the first time I was ever able to flirt openly with another human being as an adult. Stuff that people got to do when they were 12, right? Was something that I had built so much shame around, right? Even as a trans mass person, right? So as a Black trans person, right? The ways that I was able to actually even thinking about knowing that people weren't concentrating on my name and pronouns. They already knew who I was, right? They already understood and appreciated me. It wasn't a theory to them that I was actually a human being in their lives and in their world. And people don't know what it looks like to be looked at as a theory all day, right? That people are trying to show off their social justice skills instead of internalizing you all day, right? And so that's what we also want to create, is a space in which we get to be, which we get to be able to get away from the gaze of others that want us to disappear into their dreams all day, right? Into their spiritual interpretation. I have my own relationship with Allah, with God, with Goddess, and I don't need it colored by something else. I need it to expand with other people that are also having those kinds of necessary conversations about my survival.
Right.
That's right.
And I think, and for folks, just because you mentioned that it's a fundraiser too, so I just want to try to get in this right quick. I always got to bring up let's talk about that. So real rap, because people, so here's another way that we're trying to empower people. So we actually, Dane knows I'm salty from this one thing, and I'm trying to debate if I'm going to talk about it or not. Things like, I'm going to talk about it. They already know what I'm talking about. So we applied for this grant like a while ago, right? And it's a grant that is for people, it's supposed to be for gender justice, right? So it's a grant that focuses on gender justice. And there's a bunch of those grants out there in the world. Not a bunch, but there's a few. And so there's a particular organization, we handed them in the project, and we talked about things like, the reality is that most of us as Black trans people do not have 9-to-5 work, right? So most of us do not have access to 9-to-5 work, even though from little children, we're told that's what we're expected to be able to do, right? Over a third of Black trans people make less than $10,000 a year, as a household income, not even just individual, but their household will bring in less than $10,000 in a year, right? As I sit in the magical land of Seattle, which has the highest per capita rate of millionaires and billionaires in the country, right? I'm still struck by the numbers of Black trans people who are broke, who do not have access to funds all over the country, right? That many of us have experienced incarceration or will very soon, right? Because our very livelihoods are criminalized, right? As we think about all this. And so we talked about this to this organization who believes in gender justice and all these things. And what they said back to us is like, well, we can't approve your grant because we're still kind of questioning, how is this project about Black trans spirit and Black trans spirituality connected to gender justice, right? So how is this actually connected to gender justice? Even though, right, we're talking about people who are often targeted because of the ways that we present our gender, because of the ways that we are targeted for abuse even as young children, as folks who are trans and Black, even though the racialized elements of our gender, the ways that people racialize our gender in certain types of ways that make us more markers, this great organization could not see the connection. And so what I would love to say to people is that religion has a huge part in the oppression that we experience and the violence we experience. The reason that people are able to dehumanize us is because even their pastor thinks we're evil. Even their bishop won't speak on it. Even their imam will turn away and look and say, like, you need to get that kid out of your house, right? So we're calling on religious institutions that have benefited for hundreds of years, right? So I talked about that colonizer from 1500 whatever, right? That like people have been benefiting and not even knowing it and not naming it that, right? But so many of your religious institutions, if you especially like, listen, I'm talking specifically to you folks. I want you to look around your congregation. As many of you sit on brown land in predominantly white institutions, right, in white congregations, I want you to imagine that, yes, institutions that use language of social justice often also benefit from white supremacy. And how do we create a theology that demands that we do something different? And so I'm asking you all, as we think about the racialized wealth gap getting even larger, and that for, especially for trans people who are Black, right, it's, you know, our ability to survive is so dependent on us being able to have access to funds and financial resources, because that allows us to have housing. As someone who's a survivor of domestic violence, the reason I was able to get out of a physically violent situation is because I got some funding together so I could get myself out, right? And that's, again, an experience that many Black trans people have. And so with this project, we're also trying to aim, like we have a certain number that we're trying to hit because we're trying to pay every contributor $1,000. Why? Because we want to make sure we pay for their at least $1,000. Because if we could pay them $2,000, y'all hear me out there? Especially to those of y'all that this money thing is not a huge deal, like because you got it like that, right? That even having access to credit is more than 80% of Black trans people got. Right? Like most of us don't have credit cards, right? Most of us don't have families that we can call so we can even sleep on their floor, right? Like most of us don't have that. We don't have these communities. And even as I was asking you, Reverend JaeLynn, right? So most of us don't even have congregations we can necessarily show up to and be wholly embraced by. And so I'm asking y'all to think about our ability to have autonomy, our ability to have safety, and how financial resources can change a lot of people's lives. And we want to do that through this book, not just the physical resources of the text itself, but we want to pour into people's lives in that way too, in a way that sustains them.
No, I will say this. If we are not centering healing and accountability and restoration and our social justice work, what are we doing?
Nothing. That's
It
right.
is not good enough for these foundations to simply say, oh, I'm just going to give you a little bit of money so that you can, you know, run your little center that's cis-led, by the way.
Right.
They want to help the trans people, to give them, what do they call it? To, you know, to give them services, but not actually empower them. Not actually heal them of the spiritual trauma that so many of us have experienced since the minute that we came out of our parents' wombs. So like for me, if we are not talking about healing and accountability and restoration, then social justice, you can't bring none of your social justice like initiatives to my plate because I won't believe in it. For so long, we have always been given coping mechanisms to exist. We've been told to simply cope. Just cope and get by, and hopefully you won't die when you're 35, Black trans woman. Yep. If you can just cope and get by. If you can just go ahead and get these things, you can go ahead and just, maybe make it to 40, 45. Meanwhile, you have to take the whole world on your shoulders. Your heart is broken. Mm-hmm. You're existing in a place where you don't even know, you were never given even the glimpse of what healing would look like. And I know for myself and for so many people that I know, like thriving doesn't just look like, oh, I can live in a nice neighborhood, which is important, or I can drive a nice car if that's what I want to do, or everybody's buying my books, but it also looks like being healed mm-hmm. and having community and feeling loved and feeling that they're able to give love without abuse mm-hmm. in return.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Preach.
And so if social justice is not here to have, and listen, and I'm going to say this right now, And I don't know if I'm going to step on some toes there. I feel like I'm going to church.
Let the Lord use it.
Listen, we got you. We here.
We have so many leaders of organizations now who are just as abusive and are perpetuating abuser dynamics to the black, brown, transgender, nonconforming community is because these people were never given the ability to heal. They were never told that their healing will put money in their pockets. Their trauma has brought them coin. So if all social justice wants to do is continue to capitalize on black and brown trans people's trauma, I'm not here for it.
That's right.
We must pour dollars back into our communities, and it must not look how white supremacy has told us it is supposed to look, which is that we must be in pain. Our joy is revolutionary.
Yes.
And we're invested in trans people being joyful and loving and healed. I don't want to be a part of that movement.
That's right.
And that's where I'm at.
Yes.
That's clear, honey.
Listen, I got hot flashes right now. I don't listen. Hot flashes.
so much of spaces of healing and also justice work around trans and gender nonconforming issues that come from white communities and majority white communities and even cis brown communities. You have to find healing under their terms, right? And under their conditions, right? And all of those things that Lady Dane was just speaking about, particularly about what is actually behind that healing and them profiting off of our bodies. So this is why, I'm seeing this project as important. I think that BLUU is seeing it as important to lift, because this is a space where we're actually able to heal ourselves with the leaders that we choose to lead our movement. And I appreciate you two stepping forward. And although maybe even in both of your own lives, you haven't gotten the healing and the space that you've needed, but you're making space. You're giving others what you have needed all of your life. And that is honorable and worthy of all the accolades I can come up with. So thank you for that.
Thank you. No, I'm thinking about a story, actually. So when you were saying that, Dane, so especially as you're talking about, the ways that places we've been taught to just that other people can capitalize off our trauma, or that the only thing that we can capitalize off is our trauma, right? So that there's ways in which, when I watch different congregations, the different faith spaces, when do trans people and trans people of color get to be front and center, people of color? Oftentimes it's when, is it Black History Month? Let's pull you out, right? Is it Trans Day of Remembrance? Let's pull you out, right? All these things. We got Trans Day of Visibility. We got to find a second trans person to put on stage, okay? And so these are the things, we're not allowed to be experts on random days. Some of us are experts at math. I'm not, don't ask me about that. But some of us are experts at math. Some of us are experts at arts, some of us are experts at healing. Some of us are experts at theology, right? And so make space for us to be able to do all these things. I remember I got done talking to a congregation, and, I was talking about this project. I was talking about some of the pain that did direct, how do we decide that this project was important, right? And so this person, and I'll tell you, so I'm going, listen, so this is a real world example. This is just one of many, many stories, y'all. But so I had 4 people approach me. 2 of them were Black, 2 of them were white, right? Let me tell you what the Black folks did. The Black folks said, and even as I talked about the wealth gap and knowing how much people make and all the other different things, the 2 Black folks, one of them who I know does not make very much money at all, right? They're both how can we donate? Here, I'm going to slip a 20 in your pocket right now. This is important. White folks that heard that same thing, white folks that had access, and people that I know that specifically work in tech industries and other sort of stuff, all these different things, in the same congregation, both hugged me and said, thank you for talking about this. This is so important. And I said, it can't happen unless people are willing to give up resources, right?
Right.
So these same 2 Black folks that I knew consciously, because I know where they work. I'm not trying to shout them out. Well, I know where they work, so I know what the cap is, versus these 2 white folks that I knew had access to some serious funds. It's really great for them to talk about the theory, but not about to give up the resources. So again, I'm asking people, as we're talking about this, to make sure, we know we pour into each other, right? Because that's actually what we've been trained to do. That's how we know we exist in this world. And again, the resources that we have access to are very different. So I'm asking you that even if you do not identify as a trans person, as a Black person, think about the resources you have access to, whether it be in your pocket or from an institution that you're a part of, right? How are you going to help make sure that we do have spaces where we can be centered on our healing and not just when we look good for a photo op on a Trans Day of Remembrance or for a Black History Month event?
That's right.
Or for a campaign.
Or for a campaign. For a campaign.
That's right.
Inshallah. Okay.
A lot of folk, particularly within Unitarian Universalism, have been looking at Black Lives Matter, the movements around Black Lives Matter, and the state of Black folk in America. And they're always asking, I'm always hearing, how can I help? How can I help? And they're often willing to, one or two times, draw some stuff on cardboard and stand outside. But this is a real practical thing that you're actually giving. This is something that you can help with, and it will be productive. And there probably will be benefits to the white folk who give. At a minimum, it's the benefit of giving from your heart, right? Other stuff happens when you allow magic into your pulpit and into leadership that actually benefits yourself, but we're not even worried about that. This is if your heart is moved by, right, the activists of Black Lives Matter and telling us that we need to invest in the PLC community right now. This is one very practical way that you can actually donate into. Thank you. Yeah.
And the money will go into the pockets of Black trans people.
It goes right on.
Right. Like it's not like, it's not one of those things where you give and then it's like, you don't know where that money going. Because I can tell you right now, just to reflect on when we talked about the foundation earlier, that I know a lot of organizations that say that they work with us and they get lots of money to work with us, and they don't.
That's right.
They fill quotas. Because they have to report. But there are people who are still hungry, who even work at their organizations, who's still homeless, who even work at their organization, who've never really seen that money, who still work at these organizations, or even the benefits from that money. So people know what we want to pay the contributors. We are also, the money is going towards we want to pay for people's travel. We want to pay for people. We want to do per diems. We want to, so because we really want to make this retreat as well something where Black trans people can come and don't got to worry about shit.
Yes.
Wait, can I come here? Because so many times I've gone to conferences and I got to worry about how am I going to eat tonight? How am I going to, who going to pay for my hotel room? The organization is, but I got to feed myself and I only got $10 in my bank account. So we want it to also be a thing where literally Black trans people don't got to worry about nothing. Your hotel's covered. Your food is covered. Your travel is covered. And you also make money for the amazing contribution that you're going to make to the book. And because I don't believe in martyrdom, you will also be paying me and Mason to co-edit. You will also be paying the designer of the book. You will also be paying for ads and things to get the book out there. And one thing that Mason and I talked about as we reflect on my book for Black trans girls is that we really, for every book sold, we want to do a thing where it goes into a fund. There's a portion of the proceeds that goes into a fund that basically will go into each month someone's pocket in the community.
Good. Good.
So it's a continual, our ideas around this is not just a one-off, right? And we want to also save some money up so we can do a volume 2.
That's right.
So all of these things are visions that we have for this work that is about pouring into our community, not just spiritually, but also financially.
I want to thank both of you for your transparency around finances. The fact is our communities, particularly liberal religious communities, those aren't the only people watching, but particularly those, they are a little shy about talking about money, right? But our faith asks us to step forward and be honest about it. And you two have been, this is some of the most transparent finances that I've heard of any, fundraising project. It's very clear where the money is actually going. And trans and gender nonconforming folks of color cannot afford not to talk about money. We got to talk about it.
We have to.
Thank you for doing that. Just that we have about 5 minutes left. I wonder, you could either, talk about this. I'm going to ask you about visioning for, 5, maybe let's do 10 years. 10 years of Black Trans Prayer Book being fully funded, right, and growing. What does it look like in 10 years? You could choose to answer that question or anything else you want to say to us before we leave.
This book will literally change the theological landscape, right? So I think in 10 years, I'm imagining that people will have language that actually interrupts violence, that people will have language around economic justice now that also plays into faith, that people will have language for the divinity of Black trans bodies and people, that when we ask the question of like, how are Black trans people holy in your text, you'll have an answer, that people will be able to see themselves reflected, that more people will decide to stay on this planet, that more people will have a community to go to and a retreat space to come back to, right? And that we will have Black trans theologians coming out the woodwork all over, right? I want to have 15-year-olds that know they're experts of theology. I want to have 80-year-olds who've been Black trans experts of theology who never were told they were an expert in anything, knowing that they're an expert in this, right? And so that's what I imagine.
I imagine there being multiple volumes of the book. I imagine that all the contributors are actually either getting that good college tour fund money. if you tour colleges, you know what I mean, that they're all booked. That some of them are professors at places getting that good tenure money. I imagine that, as Mason said, that more people will choose to stay, because even if they don't see themselves reflected in spaces that are supposed to love us and support us, which are our spiritual spaces, they will have this book. They will have something that my generation, Mason's generation, never had. I imagine that this work will heal our world, and it will put us back on the course that we're supposed to be on, which is loving one another in a way that is absolutely radical. It is in defiance of white supremacy, and it completely and wholeheartedly embraces every Black, trans, and gender nonconforming person in the entire world as essential to the thriving and the survival of everything, point blank. That's what I hope.
Amen.
Amen. In a few days, my birthday is on Monday, and I share that because I share a birthday with a young person. Thank you in advance, Dane, Figueroa, Didi, and JaeLynn. But I share a birthday with a young person named Blake Brockington, who passed away a few years ago, who was a Black trans young person that I actually met at a faith conference that was geared towards trans folks. And I went to that faith conference, and it was primarily run by cis people. And I went to that faith conference, and I felt so defeated. And I met this person, this young Black trans person, for the first time, and he was brilliant, and he was amazing, and he was powerful. And as someone who was 10 years younger than me, you ever feel someone shine so big, it just kind of knocks you back a little bit, right? And we lost that person. And I wonder, a lot of times, as this person who saw themselves connected to faith and saw themselves connected to other people, what would have looked like if they came from a world that told him from the beginning that he was divine, and that told him that he was able to be centered, that told him all these things. And so I know one thing doesn't change everything, but for a lot of people, one thing can change the whole world and their whole imagination of possibility, right?
Sure.
Well, Ashe, amen. Blessed be. Thank you, both. May this project go well, and may it benefit, my prayer is, may it benefit our community first, and then may it blossom out and heal this world. Love be with you.
Most definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.